Don't touch that engine, Derek Sloan snapped, his voice cutting across the marble showroom. That car is worth more than everything you own. The room went quiet for half a second, not because anyone felt ashamed, but because everyone expected the man in the worn canvas jacket to lower his eyes and step back. Caleb Warren stood near the service entrance of Hayes Motor Group with a small cardboard box of parts tucked under one arm and his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, holding his other hand. Behind the glass walls, the midnight city of Denver glittered like money had learned how to become light. Inside, under bright showroom lamps, a 1969 Shelby GT500 prototype sat with its hood raised like a wounded animal too proud to collapse. For 6 hours, the dealership's best mechanics had circled it. For 2 more, a retired consultant from Detroit had listened, frowned, and walked away. By morning, that car was supposed to start in front of investors, reporters, and the board that could save or bury Madeline Hayes' family company. But now the engine only coughed, clicked, and died. It's over, one investor muttered, checking his watch. $80 million doesn't wait for nostalgia. Madeline Hayes stood beside the car in a navy suit, her blonde hair pinned back, her face calm in the way people look calm when they are holding an entire storm behind their teeth. She was the CEO, the daughter of the man whose picture hung 20 feet above the showroom floor, smiling beside that same Shelby decades ago. She had spent years proving she was more than an heir, more than a last name, more than a woman men like Derek could underestimate politely. And yet tonight, all her polish could not make the engine breathe. Caleb had only come to deliver a rebuilt fuel relay ordered by mistake from the little repair shop where he still picked up night work. His boots were dusty. His knuckles were scarred from honest labor. His daughter carried a spiral notebook full of car drawings and dreams too big for their apartment. Someone near the coffee bar whispered, "Who let the garage dad in?" A few people laughed softly. Sophie heard it. She squeezed Caleb's hand but did not cry. She had learned young that some people laughed when they did not know what else to do with goodness. Derek stepped closer, blocking Caleb's view of the engine. "Delivery goes at the counter," he said. "This is a private executive matter." Caleb nodded once, respectful, quiet. Then the ignition turned again, and the Shelby made that same broken sound, 3 uneven beats beneath the starter, a dry gasp hidden under metal and pride. Caleb's eyes lifted. He did not move toward the car. He did not raise his voice. He simply listened. Sophie tilted her head too, as if the engine had whispered to her. "Daddy," she said softly, "that engine sounds scared." Laughter flickered again, sharper this time, but Caleb did not smile. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. The smell of oil, wax floors, and expensive coffee hung in the air. Madeline looked at the child, then at the tired man beside her, and for reasons she could not explain, she did not ask security to escort them out. Caleb's gaze stayed on the Shelby, steady and almost sad. "It's not dead," he said. Derek scoffed. "Excuse me?" Caleb set the cardboard box down gently, like even cheap things deserved care. "It's not dead," he repeated. "It's choking." This time, no one laughed. Even the investors stopped checking their phones. Madeline took one slow step toward him, her voice low but firm. "And you know that from standing 30 feet away?" Caleb looked at the raised hood, then at the portrait of her father above it, then back to the car that everyone with titles had already given up on. "No, ma'am," he said. "I know it because engines don't quit all at once unless somebody teaches them how." Madeline Hayes did not answer right away. She studied Caleb Warren the way she studied quarterly numbers, quietly, carefully, looking for the weak place in the claim. Men had promised her miracles all week. Mechanics, consultants, board members, vendors with polished shoes and confident voices. Every one of them had left the Shelby sitting cold beneath the showroom lights. Derek Sloan folded his arms and gave a thin laugh. "That is a nice line," he said. "Maybe it works at a 2-bay garage on the edge of town, but this is not some pickup with a bad starter." Caleb nodded, still calm. "I know. Then you know you should step away." "I am standing still." A few employees looked down to hide their smiles, but the laughter had lost its comfort. Caleb had not challenged Derek. He had not tried to embarrass him. He simply stood there with quiet dignity, and somehow that made Derek seem louder than he meant to be. Sophie leaned against her father's side, her notebook pressed to her chest. Madeline noticed the child's shoes first, clean but worn at the toes, then the way Caleb's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, protective without being possessive, steady without making a show of it. "What would you need?" Madeline asked. Derek turned sharply. "You cannot be serious." Madeline did not look at him. I asked him a question. Caleb glanced toward the car. One start attempt. No revving. No talking over it. I need to hear the failure clean. Derek stepped between him and the Shelby. Absolutely not. That engine has already been tested by people who actually belong in this building. Caleb lowered his eyes for a breath, not in shame, but in restraint. The showroom seemed to hold itself still around him. The glass walls reflected the car, the executives, the janitors working quietly near the far hallway, and one single father who had no title worth mentioning but carried himself like a man who had survived worse rooms than this one. Madeline lifted her chin. "Give him one attempt." Derek's jaw tightened. "Madeline, this is a mistake." "Then it will be my mistake." Those 6 words changed the temperature in the room. Derek took the key from the service console with visible reluctance and slid into the driver's seat. Caleb did not approach the car. He turned his head slightly, eyes half closed, listening before the sound even began. Sophie covered one ear, not from fear, but because she knew her father always heard better when the world got smaller. The key turned. The starter spun. The Shelby coughed once, caught for less than a second, then staggered into a dry, uneven rattle before dying with a hollow click. No one spoke. Caleb opened his eyes. "Fuel is reaching." Derek stepped out. "Anyone could guess that." Caleb continued, voice low. "Spark is late." Derek's face hardened. "Careful." And somebody changed the timing to hide the reel wound. The words landed softly, but they moved through the showroom like a cold draft under a locked door. One investor slowly lowered his phone. A senior mechanic stared at the engine bay as if seeing it for the first time. Madeline's expression did not break, but something behind her eyes shifted from doubt to attention. Derek laughed too quickly. "That is absurd. There is no hidden wound. There is a complex mechanical failure beyond your understanding." Caleb looked at him then, not angry, not proud, just steady. "Maybe." He reached for the cardboard box at his feet and picked it up again. "But if I am wrong, you lose nothing except 5 minutes. If I am right, someone in this room already knows it." The silence that followed was different from the first one. It was not embarrassment. It was suspicion. Madeline walked to the edge of the service bay doors and pressed her palm against the security scanner. The doors unlocked with a soft chime. "Mr. Warren," she said, "you may look at the engine." Derek moved as if to object, but she raised one hand without turning around. Caleb gave Sophie a gentle nod to stay close, then stepped forward into the bright pool of light around the Shelby. For the first time that night, the man everyone had dismissed stood beside the machine everyone had feared, and the room began to understand that he was not there to impress them. He was there to listen to what they had ignored. Caleb did not lift a wrench at first. He walked around the Shelby slowly, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other held open at his side as if he were giving the car permission to tell the truth. Derek watched him with a tight smile, pretending confidence, but the muscles in his jaw kept moving. Madeline stood near the service bay doors with the investors behind her, their expensive coats and quiet impatience filling the glass-walled room like weather before rain. "You said there was a reel wound," she said. "What does that mean?" Caleb looked at the engine, then at the large black and white photograph of her father on the wall. In the picture, Thomas Hayes was younger than Madeline was now, sleeves rolled up, both hands resting on the same Shelby like it was a promise America had made to itself. "This was not built like a regular production car," Caleb said. "Prototype fuel mapping, early emissions adjustments, hand-routed vacuum lines. Men back then did not just assemble these. They listened to them." Derek scoffed. "A history lesson will not save us." "No," Caleb said softly. "But pride will not either." The room tightened. Madeline's eyes flicked toward Derek, then back to Caleb. Outside, a late winter wind pressed faintly against the showroom glass, and the city lights trembled in the reflection of the raised hood. Somewhere in the building, a clock moved past 12:40 in the morning. By 9, the board would arrive. By 10, the demonstration would begin. By noon, if the car stayed silent, Hayes Motor Group would be called sentimental, unstable, and ready for acquisition by people who had never cared about the name on the sign. Madeline folded her arms, but her voice softened by a fraction. My father restored this car after the recession nearly took everything from him. He used to say if this engine ever started in front of the right people, they would understand what Hayes meant. Not luxury. Not ego. Work. Caleb nodded once. Then he understood engines. He understood loyalty, she said. And tomorrow, I need that loyalty to make sense to a room full of people who only trust numbers. Sophie had wandered just far enough to study the old photograph. Her little finger traced the air beneath one corner of it without touching the frame. Daddy, she whispered, that car has a different little pipe in the picture. Derek turned sharply. Please keep the child away from company property. Caleb did not respond to the insult. He looked where Sophie pointed, and for the first time, his expression changed. Not shock. Recognition. He stepped closer to the photograph, then back to the engine bay. Madeline, he said, and the use of her first name surprised everyone, including him. Do you have the original service binder? Derek answered before she could. It is archived. Where? Not relevant. Caleb turned toward him. It may be the only relevant thing in this building. Madeline took a breath. The pressure around her was no longer just corporate. It was personal now, almost sacred. If I give you access, she said, can you make it run? Caleb looked at Sophie, then at the car, then at the CEO, who was beginning to look less like a headline and more like a daughter standing beside her father's unfinished prayer. I can try, he said. Derek laughed under his breath. You? Overnight? Caleb picked up a clean shop towel and laid it gently over the fender before touching anything. Not loudly, he said. Quietly. For a moment, no one moved. Then Madeline removed a small brass key from her blazer pocket, the one her father had carried for 30 years, and placed it in Caleb's open palm. The gesture was simple, but it changed the room. Derek's smile faded. The investors watched more closely. Sophie stood a little taller. And Caleb Warren, who had entered through the service door like a man no one needed to notice, now held the key to the one thing everyone powerful had failed to protect. Derek Sloan did not argue in front of the investors again. He was too polished for that. Instead, he smiled with professional patience and led Caleb through a side door into the older service wing, where the lights were dimmer, the floor was stained from years of honest work, and the air carried the familiar smell of oil, rubber, and cold coffee. Since you prefer quiet, Derek said, pushing open a narrow bay door, you can work in here. The room looked forgotten. A rolling tool chest sat against one wall with one broken drawer. A workbench leaned slightly to the left. The overhead light flickered every few seconds, making the Shelby's reflection in the glass partition appear and disappear like a memory no one wanted to face. Sophie looked around, then looked up at her father. Caleb gave her a gentle smile. It is all right, sweetheart. Good work does not need a pretty room. Derek placed a stack of forms on the workbench. Before you touch anything, sign these. Liability waiver. Damage acknowledgement. Temporary access agreement. And a statement confirming Hayes Motor Group did not request your services as a certified restoration specialist. Caleb read each page without complaint. His lips moved slightly as he followed the lines. Derek tapped the pen against the table. Need help with the big words? A mechanic near the doorway covered a laugh with his hand. Another lifted his phone as if the night had suddenly become entertainment. Caleb looked up, not wounded, not angry, only calm. No. I like to know what I am being blamed for before I start helping. The laughter stopped too quickly. Madeline, watching from behind the glass, heard it through the speaker system and felt something uncomfortable move in her chest. Caleb signed the papers, folded them neatly, and slid them back. Then he took off his jacket and placed it over the back of a chair for Sophie. He found a paper cup, filled it with hot cocoa from the vending machine in the hall, and set it near her notebook. You stay warm, he said. I will be right here. Sophie nodded. Do not let them make you hurry. Caleb's eyes softened. I never do my best work in a hurry. Derek rolled his eyes. Touching. Can we begin the miracle now? Caleb turned toward the Shelby. The old car had been pushed into the service wing with its hood still raised, its chrome catching the weak light in tired flashes. He laid a clean towel across the fender before resting one hand near the engine bay. That small act, that careful respect, seemed to bother Derek more than any insult could have. You know, Derek said, men like you always think machines are simple because they are the only things that listen. Caleb reached for a flashlight. Machines listen better than proud men. A young mechanic snorted, then fell silent when Derek glared. For the next several minutes, Caleb did not remove parts. He traced lines. He checked clamps. He studied the routing of wires and hoses against the old photographs Sophie had noticed. He moved slowly, but not uncertainly. There was no performance in him. No wasted motion. No need to prove he belonged. The room outside the glass began to change. Investors who had been ready to leave stayed. Senior technicians leaned closer. Madeline stood with her arms folded, but her face had lost some of its corporate armor. She watched Caleb pause at the distributor, tilt his head, and listen again to a memory inside the machine. Then, with 2 fingers, he touched a small ignition lead that looked almost correct. Almost. His expression became still. Derek saw it, and stepped forward. Problem? Caleb did not look at him. Maybe. That is not an answer. Caleb gently lifted the wire into the light. A faint mark flashed along the casing, too small for anyone careless to notice. No, Caleb said quietly. But it is a beginning. Caleb held the ignition lead under the weak garage light and turned it slowly between his fingers. To most of the room, it looked ordinary, a narrow black wire with clean ends and no obvious damage. To him, it looked like a sentence with one wrong word placed carefully enough to change the meaning. Derek stepped closer, his shoes too polished for the oil-stained floor. Are you going to stare at that all night? He asked. Caleb did not answer. He took a small magnifier from his toolbox, the kind he had bought years ago at a flea market for $3, and examined the casing near the connector. Sophie watched from the chair, her cocoa untouched now, her notebook open on her knees. Madeline stood behind the glass, one hand resting against her own elbow, as if holding herself back from entering too soon. The investors had grown quiet. Even the younger mechanics had stopped pretending this was funny. Caleb set the wire on a clean towel, then removed the distributor cap with careful hands. This was replaced, he said. Derek shrugged. Of course it was replaced. We have been diagnosing the vehicle for 2 days. Not with a matching part. It is within specification. Caleb looked up. No, sir. It is within appearance. The words were gentle, but they cut through the room with the clean edge of truth. He reached deeper into the engine bay, following the path from the ignition assembly to a small module tucked beneath the intake housing. A sharp metal edge caught the back of his hand. He paused only long enough to glance at the thin line of blood, then wrapped it with a shop towel and kept working. Sophie stood immediately. Daddy. I am okay, he said softly. It is just a scratch. Madeline entered then, no announcement, no heels clicking with authority this time. Only a woman crossing into the older service bay as if she were stepping into a memory that did not belong to her alone. She saw the towel around Caleb's hand. She saw the way he kept his body between the car and his daughter, even while focused on the work. And she saw something that made her throat tighten. He was not trying to win. He was trying to save. Caleb loosened the hidden module and brought it into the light. The piece was small, matte black, nearly identical to the original part listed in the archived binder Madeline had finally retrieved. Nearly. He placed both images side by side, then pointed to a tiny stamped mark near the lower corner. This code does not belong to the factory run. One of the senior technicians leaned in. That cannot be right. It is right, Caleb said. This module delays spark just enough under load to make the engine fail after catching. Whoever installed it knew the car would sound sick, not broken. Sick buys confusion. Confusion buys time. Derek's voice sharpened. That is speculation. Caleb wiped his fingers on the towel and turned the fake module toward the light. There, beneath a smear of grease, was a faint internal inventory mark from Hayes Motor Group, too recent to belong on a car that had been sealed in private storage for years. The silence that followed felt heavier than the engine itself. Madeline looked at the mark, then at Derek, then back at Caleb. Are you saying someone inside this building did this? Caleb did not rush to accuse. That was not his way. He set the part down with quiet care, as if even evidence deserved dignity. I am saying engines do not learn how to lie on their own. Sophie stepped beside him with a folded napkin and gently touched it to the back of his hand. Caleb smiled down at her. Thank you, sweetheart. Madeline watched the child care for the father, and the father care for a machine tied to another daughter's grief, and for the first time that night, the $80 million seemed smaller than the gray standing in that stained little room. Caleb turned back to the Shelby and spoke so softly only those nearest could hear. Some things are worth fixing gently. Madeline did not say anything. She could not. Because in that moment, the man her company had laughed at was bleeding for a legacy that was not even his. By 3:17 in the morning, the old service wing had become quieter than a church after the last hymn. The investors had drifted into the lounge, not because they stopped caring, but because exhaustion had made their doubt heavy. The younger mechanics leaned against tool cabinets with folded arms and tired eyes. Derek stood near the doorway, pretending to check messages, though his gaze kept returning to the small black module on Caleb's towel. Madeline remained inside the bay now, no longer watching from behind glass. She had taken off her blazer and rolled her sleeves just past her wrists, not to help in any useful way, but because standing untouched beside a working man suddenly felt wrong. Caleb had replaced the false module with the closest compatible part he could rebuild from the relay box he had brought, but one problem remained. The Shelby's prototype vacuum routing did not match the archived binder. Somewhere between the factory floor, her father's restoration, and 30 years of guarded history, one small line had been moved. Start it wrong, and the engine would not be saved. It would suffer again. We need the original routing map, Caleb said. Derek looked up too quickly. The binder is original. Caleb shook his head. The binder is official. That is not always the same thing. A senior technician rubbed his forehead. There may have been handwritten notes. Mr. Hayes kept private folders. Madeline turned to him. Where? The man hesitated. Old records room, maybe. But it has not been indexed since the remodel. Derek cut in. We do not have time to chase ghost paperwork because a delivery mechanic has a feeling. Caleb's voice stayed even. It is not a feeling. It is a missing breath. Sophie, who had been quiet for nearly an hour, looked up from her notebook. Her hair was loose now, falling across one cheek, and her eyes were red from fighting sleep. Daddy, she said, what does a missing breath look like? Caleb crouched beside her chair. Like a place where air should go, but does not. Sophie thought about that. Then she turned back several pages in her notebook, past drawings of school buses, pickup trucks, and the tiny apartment she and Caleb called home. She stopped at the sketch she had made earlier from the photograph in the showroom, the one of Thomas Hayes smiling beside the Shelby. Her drawing was not perfect. The wheels were too round, the hood too long, and her pencil lines wandered the way children's lines do when imagination matters more than measurement. But near the engine bay, beneath the raised hood, she had drawn a tiny curved hose running behind the intake, copied from the old photograph with the faithful attention of a child no one had thought to consult. Is this a breath? She asked. Caleb took the notebook carefully. The room leaned toward him. Madeline stepped close enough to see the page, and something in her face changed. In the old photograph, the detail had been half hidden by her father's forearm. In Sophie's drawing, it was clear because innocence had no reason to overlook it. Caleb carried the notebook to the engine and held it beside the binder diagram. One line was different. Small. Almost laughable. The kind of thing proud men miss because they are too busy proving they already know enough. Derek swallowed. That is a child's drawing. Caleb nodded. Yes. He traced the pencil curve with one clean finger. And it may be the only honest document in the room. No one laughed. Madeline reached for the old photograph on her phone, zoomed in, and compared it to the notebook. Her lips parted slightly, not in command but wonder. My father changed it himself, she whispered. He must have found a better way. Caleb looked down at Sophie. You found what we needed. Sophie blinked, unsure whether grown-ups were allowed to mean praise that fully. I just copied the picture. That is how truth survives sometimes, Caleb said. Someone small enough to notice carries it forward. The overhead light flickered once more, but now the room did not feel forgotten. Caleb rerouted the lines slowly, using Sophie's drawing as a guide and Madeline's father's photograph as a witness. When the final hose settled into place, The engine seemed different even before it started, as if the old machine had finally been allowed to breathe through its own memory. Derek stepped back into the shadow near the door. Madeline saw him move, but for the first time that night, she did not follow fear. She followed grace. And Caleb, with his daughter's notebook open on the fender, whispered, "That is it." Derek moved before anyone else could speak. "Stop," he said, his voice sharp enough to make the tired mechanic straighten. Caleb's hand paused above the ignition lead, not startled, only still. Madeline turned from the fender, Sophie's notebook still open beside her father's photograph. "Why?" she asked. Derek stepped into the brighter part of the bay, his face arranged into concern so carefully it almost looked rehearsed. "Because this has gone too far. A child's drawing is not a technical source, a rebuilt relay from a cardboard box is not a certified restoration part, and this man has already removed components from a vehicle worth more than most homes in this county." Caleb lowered his hand. "I removed the false component." "You removed company property," Derek said. "And now you are about to start an irreplaceable engine based on guesswork." A few investors had returned from the lounge, drawn by the raised voices. The old service wing filled again with coats, whispers, and the pale blue glow of phones. Madeline looked at Caleb, then at Derek. "You told me the original module was factory matched." Derek's eyes flickered. "Because that is what my team reported." Caleb picked up the false module from the towel and placed it on the workbench between them. "Then your team should explain this inventory mark." Derek did not look down. "Marks can be transferred. Parts can be mishandled. Especially when strangers are given access." The accusation settled over the room like dust. Sophie slid closer to Caleb. He rested one hand gently on her shoulder and said nothing. That restraint bothered Madeline more than any denial could have. A man who was guilty usually tried to outrun silence. Caleb stood inside it with dignity. Derek reached for his phone. "I am calling security. We need to document this before he causes further damage." Madeline's voice cut through the room, quiet but final. "No. We are going to document what already happened." Derek froze. "What does that mean?" She turned to the senior technician. "Pull the overnight camera logs for this bay and the storage corridor. Start at 6 last evening." The technician hesitated, then opened a wall console. Derek gave a small laugh. "Madeline, this is humiliating." "Yes," she said, watching the screen wake up. "It is." The footage rolled across the monitor in grainy silence. Empty bay. Flickering light. The Shelby resting under a service cover. Then, at 11:23 the night before, a figure entered alone with an access card and a small parts case. The camera angle caught the man's profile when he turned toward the workbench. Derek Sloan. No one spoke. The video showed him lifting the hood, removing a module, replacing it, then wiping the casing before leaving through the side door. Derek's face lost its color by degrees, as if the truth had dimmed him from the inside. "That is not what it looks like," he said. Caleb looked at the screen, then at the part on the table. "It usually is." Madeline stared at Derek, and behind her anger was something deeper, a daughter realizing her father's legacy had not failed on its own. "Why?" she asked. Derek swallowed. "The company was already vulnerable. The acquisition offer would have protected jobs. It would have handed my father's name to people who wanted it cheap," Madeline said. He looked away. "You would not listen." Caleb's voice was almost gentle. "So you made the engine speak for you." The room went quiet again, but this silence had weight. It was not confusion now. It was judgment without shouting. Madeline signaled to the building's security manager near the doorway. "Escort Mr. Sloan to the conference room and preserve every file connected to his access." No one touched him harshly. No one needed to. Derek walked out smaller. Then he had entered, followed by the echo of his own polished shoes. Caleb turned back to the Shelby, but Madeline stopped him with one word. "Caleb." He looked over. Her eyes were bright, not with weakness, but with the cost of being strong for too long. "Can it still be saved?" Caleb glanced at Sophie's drawing, the old photograph, and the engine waiting under the trembling light. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "But now it deserves to be started in the morning, where everyone can hear the truth." Morning arrived slowly, first as a pale silver line across the Denver skyline, then as a clean wash of gold through the showroom glass. By 8:45, Hayes Motor Group no longer looked like a place that had spent the night holding its breath. The floors had been polished, the coffee refreshed, the press badges checked at the door, and the board members gathered near the stage with the cautious expressions of people who had prepared for disappointment. The Shelby waited beneath the lights, hood lowered now, chrome shining, tires dressed, its old body carrying the quiet dignity of something that had survived both neglect and betrayal. Caleb stood beside it in the same work shirt from the night before, sleeves rolled to the forearms, one hand wrapped in a clean white bandage. Sophie stood a few feet behind him with her notebook hugged against her chest, her eyes wide at the crowd. Madeline Hayes stepped onto the small platform near the car, no longer wearing the armor of a woman trying to impress men who doubted her. She looked tired but steady. She looked like a daughter. "Before we discuss contracts," she said, her voice carrying through the showroom, "there is something my father would have wanted you to hear." A board member shifted. An investor whispered, "Is the demonstration still happening?" Another muttered, "After last night, I would not risk it." Madeline heard them and did not flinch. "This company was built by people who believed a machine could carry memory, work, and promise in the same steel body. Last night someone tried to turn that promise into a failure." The room stirred, but she lifted one hand, and the sound faded. She did not name Derek in front of the cameras. She did not need spectacle. Truth did not need decoration. "And last night," she continued, "a man most of us would have walked past stopped long enough to listen." Caleb looked down, uncomfortable with praise. Sophie looked up at him like the praise had been overdue for years. Madeline turned toward him. "Mr. Warren, whenever you are ready." The showroom grew so quiet that the hum of the lights seemed loud. Caleb opened the driver's door and paused, his fingers resting on the edge of the roof. For a moment, he looked not at the crowd, but at Sophie. She nodded, small and brave. Then he looked at Madeline. She held the brass key out in both hands, the key her father had carried for 3 decades. Caleb accepted it with the care of a man receiving something holy, then slid into the driver's seat. The leather creaked softly beneath him. His boots settled on the floor mat. His bandaged hand closed around the key. In that final second before the turn, every laugh from the night before seemed to hang in the air, waiting to learn whether it had been foolish or cruel. Caleb turned the key. The starter engaged. 1 breath. 2. The Shelby caught, stumbled once, then roared awake with a deep, clean thunder that rolled through the showroom and seemed to shake dust loose from the past itself. No one clapped. Not at first. The sound was too full, too alive, too impossible for applause to touch. The investors stared. The mechanics stared. The reporters lowered their phones without realizing it. Madeline pressed one hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled as the engine settled into a steady, powerful idle, not angry, not wild, but whole. Sophie smiled through tears she did not bother hiding. Caleb stepped out and closed the door gently, letting the engine speak for itself. The entire showroom remained silent. Not empty silence. Not awkward silence. The kind of silence that comes when pride finally kneels before the truth. Then one senior mechanic, the oldest man in the room, removed his cap and whispered, "That is how Thomas Hayes tuned it." Madeline looked at Caleb as if she were seeing him fully for the first time. He did not bow. He did not boast. He simply wiped a trace of oil from his wrist and stood beside the car with quiet grace, while the world that had dismissed him had no choice but to listen. The applause came late, and maybe that was why it mattered. It did not rise like noise. It rose like understanding. First from the oldest mechanic with his cap in his hands, then from a young receptionist near the front desk, then from the investors who had spent the night measuring value in numbers and finally saw value standing in oil-stained sleeves beside a little girl with a notebook. Madeline let the sound fill the showroom for a moment before she raised her hand. "This morning's agreement will move forward," she said, and the relief that passed through the room was almost visible. "But not because a car started. Because the truth did." The board chair stepped forward with the signed documents, his expression changed from caution to respect. Reporters whispered into microphones. Cameras turned toward Caleb, but he instinctively stepped back, placing himself half a pace behind Sophie as if fame were just another bright light he did not need to stand under. Madeline noticed. She had known men who chased attention like oxygen. Caleb seemed to breathe better without it. When the formal signing ended, she found him near the Shelby's front fender, wiping his tools one by one before placing them back in his dented metal box. "You saved my company," she said. Caleb shook his head. "No, ma'am. I fixed an engine. You saved the company when you chose to hear the truth." Madeline looked down, and for the first time all morning, the CO disappeared enough for the daughter to speak. "My father would have liked you." Caleb gave a small, tired smile. "I think I would have liked him too." Sophie stood beside the open passenger door, staring at the Shelby's dashboard like she had entered a museum where everything was allowed to breathe. Madeline walked over and crouched to her level, careful not to make the moment too grand. "That drawing of yours helped us more than half the files in this building." Sophie hugged the notebook tighter. "I just saw what everybody missed." Madeline smiled gently. "That is a rare gift." Then she stood and turned back to Caleb. "I want you to run our Heritage Restoration Division. Full salary, benefits, whatever equipment you need. You and Sophie would never have to worry about rent again." The offer hung there, generous and shining. Several employees nearby looked at Caleb as if no sane man would take more than 3 seconds to say yes. But Caleb only glanced at his daughter, then at the old service wing where tired mechanics were still cleaning up the long night. "I am grateful," he said. "Truly. But if I take it, I want one condition." Madeline's eyebrows lifted. "Name it." "Build a training program. For single parents who cannot afford trade school. For veterans trying to start over. For young people who have been told they are only good for sweeping floors. Teach them diagnostics, restoration, patience, respect. Not charity. A real path." The showroom quieted again, but this time the silence was tender. Madeline looked at the Shelby, then at the portrait of her father, then at the man who had asked not for more comfort, but for more second chances. "Done," she said. Caleb nodded once, as if the word itself was enough. Weeks later, the first class met in the renovated service wing. On the wall hung Sophie's framed drawing beside the original photograph of Thomas Hayes. Beneath them, a small brass plaque read, "Listen before you judge. Fix what you can. Respect what still has life in it." And on the first morning of the program, Madeline watched Caleb teach a nervous young mother how to hear a misfire without fear. Sophie sat nearby, sketching another car, while sunlight poured across the clean concrete floor. No one in that room looked invisible anymore. That was the real miracle. Not the engine. Not the contract. Not even the applause. The miracle was that quiet dignity had opened a door, and through it walked people who had almost stopped believing they deserved one. Caleb Warren never became loud. He never needed to. Some men proved themselves by taking over a room. He proved himself by making room for others. And sometimes, when grace is given enough time, it does more than repair what is broken. It teaches the world how to listen again.